What's wrong with business decisions is what we're talking about today on the East Central Business Show. I'm John Naylor and I'm joined by Ian Plowman once again from Cooperative Conversations.
Hello John, how are you?
Thank you very much for continuing this conversation. Really great that last video we did. I want to explore this time what's wrong with business decisions. What's the history of this decision making?
Well, we seem to make decisions in a couple of ways.
Yeah.
And people can commonly identify with this. We often make decisions by exhaustion. We sit around and we talk about this for 3 or 4 hours and we're all getting wilted and what have you, and we've seen, in fact, our own governments force through legislation.
Oh, at midnight or beyond.
Exactly, crazy stuff. Right, so we sometimes make decisions that way.
That by definition is going to be a bad decision, hasn't it?
Inevitably it's going to be a bad decision.
It's a war of attrition.
Absolutely. Or the decision gets made, we might talk around it a lot, but we actually know, and it's made pretty clear to us what the boss wants to have happen.
Oh, we've never seen that before.
Or the most dominant person in the room wants to have happen. And therefore we're not really buying into the wisdom that's available to us.
Yeah,
right?
I'm guilty of that.
Another way we make decisions. We ask an expert.
Okay. Now, well, but they're an expert. What's wrong with that?
Because experts, by virtue of definition, have depth in their subject area,
yes,
right,
yes,
and lack of breadth. And if you ask a particular expert, let's say we ask a carpenter, right? Mm-hmm. Every problem looks like a nail because he owns a hammer, right?
Yeah, okay.
And so he redefines the problem to look like a nail where it may not be a nail at all, okay?
Yeah.
And if we really attempted democracy, we use the Roberts Rules of Order. Now, the Roberts Rules of Order are used by the Westminster system. They were developed in roughly 1893 or thereabouts, and they're widely used. And an example is, through you, Madam Chair, I'd like to move this particular motion.
Yes.
We talk about it a bit, and then we say, for a show of hands, all those in favour say yes, all those against say no. Right, and the decision gets made on the hands.
Now, what's wrong with that?
What that automatically does is that anybody who was in the nay side, right, doesn't have commitment to the decision because they felt like they've been done and they felt that other people didn't really understand their perspective, and so they might comply with the decision, but their heart's not there.
No, that's right. That's caustic.
And so it's costing the organisation a lot. Or we often make decisions with the absence of sufficient information, often when there's a sense of urgency, right? And the reason for that is that we ask the people that are available to us, those people that we can gather at 10 minutes notice or whatever when we call a meeting, right? And so they tend to be relatively homogeneous. In other words, they're from the same part of the building or the same part of the organisation, etc., etc. And yet wise decisions are based on diversity. The more diversity we have in the decision makers, the more points of view we're likely to have, the wiser the decision
So how do we get that done? Hit me with some bullet points around that.
Okay. The following people should be in the conversation.
Yes.
The person who can kill it, the person who has authority over us and probably is financing this. Right?
So the guy holding the purse strings.
The guy holding the purse strings, right? Mm-hmm. The professionals who this is their bailiwick, this is their subject matter, right? We should be asking them. We should also be asking the people who actually have to implement the decision, the field workers, right? The people who know what it's like in 40 degrees and it's fishing down with rain.
You don't see that very much.
Because they're the ones who are going to know practically whether it will work or not. We need to ask the beneficiaries or victims, those who will be impacted upon it, does this have unintended consequences for people? So we need to explore a range of stakeholders, and if they can't all be in the room, what we want to do is to nominate each person who is in the room and say, John, would you represent the boss, please?
Oh, okay.
And Peter, would you represent our professionals?
So what you're saying, even if there's not that body representing the room, you can delegate the responsibility, have them empathise.
As a proxy for them, right?
Yep.
And so Jane is representing the clients or the beneficiaries or victims, and Christine is representing the field workers and what have you. And
they get the role play in this.
Absolutely.
This process.
And now that they know that that's their job, right? If those people can't be in the conversation, and the agenda has gone out in advance, so those participants know what the conversation's about. Christine says, OK, I'm a proxy for, I haven't got a clue what they think, I better go and check before I represent them in the meeting. So we're looking for wiser decisions.
OK.
So, so the methods of decisions that we make, by exhaustion, by expert, by social dominance, by rules of Roberts,
voting,
those sort of things are suboptimal, and yet they are the methods that most organisations use.
You're saying they're greater than 100 years old?
Many of them.
Oh, but, well, actually, many of them go
What?
back to primeval times.
Absolutely, social dominance does, right? Or who can kill it?
Yes.
Right? Who's the boss? So who holds the purse strings? So what we need is some different decision tools, democratic decision tools that bring into the decision all the wisdom of that diversity we have available to us, even if they're a relatively junior player.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Sure.
So the junior players have no more influence or less influence than the senior players in terms of making a recommendation. Right? And so there are a range of decision tools in cooperative conversations.
Yeah, and in your head, you've got a bunch of knowledge around this subject, haven't you?
That are
incredible.
Completely
really
democratic.
enjoying this.
Now, just as a small example, and we talk about innovation. One of the things we know about innovation is that we have good ideas, right? The other thing we know about innovation is other people have good ideas. When it comes to arguing for a good idea, we tend to argue for our own, right? Now, what would happen in a decision process if we've got a range of ideas put on the table, right, or listed on a whiteboard or whatever it happens to be, and we look at them and we say, OK, choose the 5 that we think have got the most merit. And by the way, you cannot choose any of your own.
Oh, OK.
Right?
Sounds like a European song competition.
So you constrain, because that immediately tries to push ego out, and you're just considering the ideas on the merits, and you could do that easily if they're not your own, right?
Okay.
And if you know you can't consider your own, right? And so when you pool those together, the most valuable idea emerges. And this is precisely the way swarms of bees and schools of fish and flocks of birds make decisions. By collective and individual and independent decisions, pooled and aggregated.
Okay.
Right? And so
at some point it tips over in favour and it becomes obvious.
It becomes obvious, right? Which is the wisest decision, and we don't need to know who suggested it. Because that's the wisdom emerges. It's like 2 boxers in a boxing ring, right? If we can dance around the decision, right, rather than being forced into the corner and defend our decision, we get a much better decision.
Okay, and
collective decision.
That in a nutshell, is that consensus?
Yes, for want of a word, it's consensus. It's engineered consensus. It's not consensus by exhaustion, which we often, gets labelled as consensus, right? The weakest people give up, and finally one decision remains.
Yes.
Now, it's a decision it's consensus that pools all of the wisdom, like baking a cake. You put all of the ingredients together, and the sum is better than the parts.
Okay, all right. So, long story short, so summarising around this, so there's the problem typically with meetings is that there's an expert that's got a narrow-minded view or narrow view of the situation, hasn't taken in all the parts and pieces of it. Exhaustion knocks people around, and eventually the weakest drop off, and the alpha male or the boss takes over and railroads things through. Or a voting decision that leaves things 50-50 or nearabouts, where people are put offside. Exactly. Which is going to leave them with negativity. So if you can work it right, you get to a level of consensus, and with various stakeholders represented, you're going to get a good decision to move on.
Absolutely. What we're looking for is pooled wisdom.
Pooled wisdom. I love the sound of that. Ian, how do people get hold of you? You've got a bit of paper.
My mobile number,
fabulous.
0417 705 489.
Yep.
Or on the web, www.cooperativeconversations, all one word, no hyphen, .com.au.
Fabulous, Ian. Okay, thank you very much for coming on the East Central Business Show.
Thanks very much, John.
We're done
Thanks
for this
for having me.
No worries at all. We're done for this episode of the East Central Business Show. I'm John Naylor.